Let's go ahead and open in prayer. And since we've had a 2-week break, I didn't assign anybody to open us in prayer, so I'll go ahead and do that. So, to open in prayer, He is risen!
He is risen indeed!
Hallelujah! Amen. Do I really need to say anything more than that? All right. Because we didn't say it in church today, we managed to say just about everything else that you can say in an hour and 17-minute service. But we did not say He is risen, He is risen indeed.
Well, where are the Easter hymns?
That's true. Although, you know what I heard this morning, Janet? We were listening to WDLM.
Yes.
And I just said, I know that song.
Yes.
I go, I think that's a Christmas song. And Lisa's like going, I don't know. And then all of a sudden I hear the word Christmas. And I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure it's a Christmas song. They just said the word Christmas. And it's just, and I'm like going, I know the tune, I just can't bring it up. And it was, as with tidings men of old, did the shining star behold. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's a Christmas song. I go, but you know what? Why don't you play Christmas songs on Easter? Why not?
Why do you play Easter songs?
Why not? I mean, you know, I'm not talking Jingle Bells or anything like that, but why can't you talk your truly religious Christian Christmas songs at Easter? Because He's back again. He's come back to this world. And Lisa goes, well, I think I should play Christmas music year-round. I go, let's not get carried away here. So, you know, we got to draw the line someplace. Yeah, we got a fun subject today. You know, you see something like that. This is exactly why Marge does not like the book of Revelation. When you've got people like this on top of beasts like this, you know, that's pretty much why you skip on. You just go, you know, I'm going to go to the next book of the Bible. Ooh, gets a ring out of it. So can't really do that. Then you end up back in Genesis. So we're going to talk about this lovely lady a little bit. And it's worth discussing because there are some very real things for us today that we're going to have to be able to recognize when the time comes. But I will just tell you right up front that when that time comes, those of us Christians that are around will be able to recognize them. That will be one of my recurring themes, if you haven't caught on to it already, is that what we may not understand in Revelation right now, we will clearly understand if we find ourselves in those times. Revelation is not a quiz. Revelation is not a test God gives to Christians, seeing if we're going to pass the ultimate test. Revelation is a warning to us. And if we don't understand it, if we're sitting here today going, I'm not so sure, well, chances are we don't need to be sure because we're not there yet. Because when that time comes, when that pretty lady is on that pretty 10-headed beast, we're going to recognize it when it occurs. Let me take a step back and talk about today. Janet Gailey's daughter introduced me, and also Janet mentioned this at our first session, a class taught on the book of Revelation by a professor at the Concordia Seminary. His name is Lewis Brighton. He has been teaching there for about 30-odd years, if I recall correctly, from his introductory class. And so he's going all the way through, and he has a very interesting manner of teaching. Somehow or another, I think he's managed to make it through the class without knowing any of the students' names in his class. I believe I've said this before, he says, any questions? And then goes immediately on to the next thing without leaving 1 second for anybody to ask a question. I think I've heard one question so far, and I've listened to about 7 or 8 sessions so far. This is how he laid out his lecture series. And you can find this. It's on iTunes. If you know how to get there, you type in Concordia, Revelation in the search box. This will pretty much pop right up. You can either watch it as a video, you can do it as an audio. And so his introduction, he spent 200 minutes, over 3 hours, introducing the book of Revelation. He hasn't even gotten to the first chapter. 3 hours, which is probably 4 hours of class time, speaking merely on what Revelation was and what it was supposed to mean. And you can see some of the earlier chapters. You know, he's got a couple of classes, about 100 minutes here. When I laid out this class, there's parts of the book that I like and there's parts that I don't like. And when David was kind enough to ask to join in, I decided to try to give him the parts I didn't like. And for the most part, I was successful. But I didn't do a very good job because I got stuck with chapters 4 and 5. So I had to do those, and I didn't really want to do them. And I got stuck with today, which I didn't really want to do either. But that's the way life goes. 2 chapters of today's reading. How long does Professor Brighton spend on those 2 chapters? Approximately 45 minutes on the 2 chapters. So if one of the most learned men on the book of Revelation on this planet spends 45 minutes on this, then I should probably reasonably spend maybe about 15, because I probably don't have his wealth of knowledge or anything like that. But no, when we have the time, we'll go ahead and fill it, and some of which I say might even be interesting. We'll have to see. This is his book that came out. This came out not that long ago. You can get it at CPH. It costs $24.95. I think it would be a welcome addition to our church library in order to have something written by a Concordia professor that talks about, that is his commentary on the book of Revelation. I don't know how you go about finding that book, other than maybe looking at this address down here. But I would love to see that book added to the church library. I think that would be an outstanding find. $24.95. So we begin. We start at Revelation chapter 17. This is pretty much similar. I believe I'm following along on what will be lesson 11 in the study guides. The lessons themselves didn't really give me a whole lot of edification. They didn't really bring out anything more to me. So for the most part, I'm making it up as I go along today. So we'll see how things turn out. So we start, and a lot of it's going to be me reading Revelation, because that's what you do when you got time to kill and you don't have anything better to do. You read the Bible out loud. Or you talk about what you're going to do like I'm doing now. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." The angel carried me away into the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She had a golden cup in her hand filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her head was a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes, every mother's hope for her daughter, and the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. We're going to discuss this in a little greater depth at the end, or probably in the middle. I don't exactly remember where. As I laid this out, I got kind of confused as to every time I looked at it, I couldn't remember what I wrote and when I wrote it or why I wrote it either. So that really is, you can truly tell I committed this to memory and to thought. But when we see about this woman, a woman sitting on the scarlet beast, the woman is the false prophet. And the false prophet is the false church. And we're going to talk quite a bit about the false church, because there's quite a few people that have some thoughts or two on what their definition of the false church is. And I'll probably return to that theme in a couple weeks when I'm standing up in front of you again discussing the millennial kingdom a little bit. The beast that the woman is on is considered to be the Antichrist. Now, the Antichrist is not Satan. The Antichrist is Satan's minion that is to rule over the world. So you've got pretty much a joinder of 2 really bad things. You've got a false church combined with a false leader. And so I don't want to use the word theocracy, because that's not the right term, but you're talking about a religious government that is the wrong religion. So you've got bad combined with bad. And when you do put those 2 things together, when you put bad together with bad, you get really bad. So things are not going to be very good. But like I said, when we look at those things, we look at it in the lens of modern day events. Is this happening today? Yeah, I admit I scratch my head from time to time. I read things, I see things I don't understand. But I have a hard time, and that doesn't mean I'm right, but I have a hard time saying, this is happening right now. Wake up. Come on. It's time. Maybe it is, and I'm just not smart enough to figure it out. I don't rule that out. But I just don't see that. I don't see that to this point yet. I'm not saying that we couldn't be well on the way to that point. Because when you talk about one world government, well, we're walking toward that path slowly but surely. When you see one world religion, well, if that religion is defined as secularism, I would strongly argue that we're well on the path to that. When that religion is pretty much accepting anything but Christianity, then I would say that we're very much down that path. But we're not there yet. Now, the New Testament does not simply reserve for Revelation the places where it's going to talk about apostasy, which is the false teaching, false churches. You're going to find several places there. The first one you're going to see is Paul, second letter to the Thessalonians. For those of you that are familiar with this letter, you may not be, but you'll be familiar with the term that this regards to, and that is one of the most descriptive terms you will ever see in the New Testament. That is the man of lawlessness. Talk about a term that should chill you to your very core. The man of lawlessness. So that means that's a person that pretty much gets to make it up as they go along. That is a person that has no code that they adhere to other than the one that they do as they wish. What is lawlessness? Lawlessness is beyond anarchy. Let me talk about anarchy for a moment. Every 17-year-old kid thinks anarchy is a great thing. Oh man, nobody should be in charge. There shouldn't be any rules. We should just be able to have the freedom to do whatever the heck we want. And then luckily for those 17-year-old kids, they turn 18 and they realize that that's just stupid. Because anarchy, nothing can happen in anarchy. There's no structure. Anarchy is pretty much the absence of any relevant authority to tell you what you can do and what you can't do. And if anything goes, well then, anything goes is fine until anything goes against you. Then it's a problem. And then you need law. So when you read about the man of lawlessness, this is the man of anarchy. This is the man of total and complete, utter chaos. I don't think we're at that point yet. Again, I could be wrong, I could make an argument, but I don't think we're at that point of total and complete societal breakdown yet. You go to 1 Timothy 4. I've referenced this verse before. These verses refer to scoffers. And those are the people that actually come by. I want to read those verses. The Spirit clearly says that in the later times some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Things taught by demons. And what's that demon going to say? He's going to say things like, did he really say you weren't supposed to eat from that tree? Did he really say you weren't supposed to do that? And you're going to say, yeah, man, I'm a modern day thinker. That Bible was written 2,000 years ago, and man, I don't know if we really should be held to things like that. It's going to sound so smooth. It's going to sound so welcoming and warming, and it will lead to utter and complete and total damnation. And so, this isn't going to be an army of people breaking into our house in the middle of the night, throwing us in jail for being Christians. Perhaps that could happen, but it's going to be much more insidious than that. It's going to happen much, I don't know, we may not even realize that it's happening. It's going to be so smooth. And that's why Jesus writes about it. That's why Paul writes about it, because they need to be on their guard. 2 Peter 2, I think there's one verse there I want to read. Let's see. But there were also false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. There were. Peter's talking about back in his day. Keep in mind, what are Paul and Peter doing as they write these letters? They're doing two things. Number one, they're telling people, they're laying the foundations for the church. Christ is gone. Paul and Peter, John, the other apostles, are the second generation of the church. So they're laying that foundation, and they are preparing the church for the third generation, for when they're not there. Because at some point, and that point for Paul and Peter was around 65 AD, they ended, and at that point this church needed to continue. So Peter and Paul are warning these people, both the present day warnings and also of the future. When they're gone, there's going to be opportunities for false teaching in that. There's always going to be false prophets. False prophets are out there today. That I will tell you. There are people out there speaking in the name of Christ that are not using Christ's word. I didn't think about it hard enough before I came in today. I probably shouldn't give an example anyway. But there are people out there that are distorting Christ's word, that are misquoting Christ's word, and that are actually taking Christ's word and pretty much making it go 180 degrees opposite of the way that it is. That is apostasy. That is false teaching. As I mentioned some time back, apostasy is not a mistake. I make mistakes up here. I'm going to make a mistake each and every time I'm in front of you. What that mistake is, I don't know. It's not intentional. I'm not trying to mislead you. It's just me being uninformed on a given area. It's going to happen. Apostasy is intentional. Apostasy is knowing that you are teaching the false word and knowing full well that you're doing it. And so that's what Peter and Paul and Christ himself said it just as much, said it as well in his words also. Be aware, be prepared for the false prophets because they are going to be there. Prostitute. We got some definitions. We know this one. Offer indiscriminately for sexual intercourse. I like this part. Especially for money. Especially for money. I thought it was pretty much just more money, but whatever. One that we probably don't talk about as much. To devote to corrupt or unworthy purposes. To prostitute ourselves. To sell ourselves short. The third definition I don't have down here, that would be our wives. Pretty much every girlfriend prior to our wife would be her definition would be a prostitute. But that's really neither here nor there. When we talk about prostitution, yeah, this is bad enough. But this is pretty much when anybody sells their beliefs for whatever reason. Judas sold his beliefs for 30 pieces of silver. Other people will sell their beliefs for any number of things. Fame, money, acceptance, whatever the case may be. This is what happens. Prostitution, another word for this very well could be acquiescence. Anytime, well, I should just keep my mouth shut. I just need to get along. I don't want to rock the boat. Sometimes that is not necessarily a bad way to go. Sometimes there's no point in being a jerk. But if it's wrong, it's wrong. And at some point, if it's wrong and we don't say anything about it, then we're abetting it. We're becoming complicit in it. We're allowing it to happen. And so that is when we talk about prostitution, we talk about that prostitute riding that beast, that is anybody that is cheapening or lowering their standards. Anybody that is debasing their core beliefs and just saying, oh, it's not that bad. And maybe they'll leave me alone. Maybe they'll leave me alone are some of the saddest words in the history of human language for the very simple reason is that once you acquiesce, you might as well get used to it because you're not going to stop. Because once you've given that inch, you better be prepared to give that mile because it's going to keep on going. It never stops. Once you give up, you know what? Maybe the Catholic Church should go ahead and ordain, gay priests. I mean, come on. This is the 21st century. We're modern people. God didn't really mean that. Well, okay. Imagine that happens. You think that's where it ends? That's where it starts. It only keeps on going downhill from there. It will only get worse. And so anytime you talk about prostitution, you talk about somebody that is debasing themselves for a corrupt or unworthy purpose. Does prostitution happen accidentally? I don't think so. I think there's some intent that goes on here. I don't think there's too many prostitutes out there in the world that just say, oh, I accidentally turned into a prostitute. I just woke up one day and I don't know what happened. Somebody gave me money and whatever. Prostitution is intentional. This type of prostitution is intentional. This type of prostitution, it's intentional, but I'm not sure if the people that are practicing this are aware of it. It's intentional because they allowed it to happen. They didn't stop themselves. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. And the angel said to me, why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. I'm going to spend significant time on this term in 2 weeks. I toyed with doing it today. I will go ahead and do it in 2 weeks. But I will tell you, the book of life is not a term that you see frequently mentioned in the Bible. I found 2. First one of all places is back in Psalms. When you go back to Psalm 69, and I'll just go to the very bottom. I'll go with 27. Charge them with crime upon crime. Do not let them share in your salvation. May they be blotted out of the book of life and not be listed with the righteous. So already, 1,000 years prior to Christ's birth, we've already got some concept of there's going to be a separation between the evil and the good. Now, this was one of David's very common themes. He very much wanted God's righteous anger to come down against his enemies. And many of his psalms are pretty much David saying, God, take care of this. And for the most part, God did. But we see there, that David even recognizes that there's 2 sides. Go ahead, Marcia.
I've heard that everybody, this is just what some people think, that everybody's name is written in the book of life, and then it's taken out, and would that substantiate that?
Seems
that
reasonable
your
to
name
me.
is blotted out at some point?
Seems reasonable to me. I mean, if our name is not initially written in the book of life, what's the point? Why are we here? If we are doomed, and this gets back to predestination, which I don't really want to get into that deeply. But if we're doomed from the get-go, then how can God really say you're responsible when I was never there in the first place? I think you're right. I think that's pretty much what free will substantiates, Marcia, is that. Man, go right ahead.
Just we oftentimes get over anxious about, are we saved and then lose it, or do we choose to be saved? And it's important to remember that we don't make that choice at all, and are not capable of it.
Absolutely.
In a small way, the pressure is off of us. The only thing we can do is leave the gift laying there.
We can leave it. Yes, we can. I mean, that you get down to the word "accept," and that's always a funny word, in the Lutheran faith, and that we believe that we cannot accept Christ of our own. We confess that, and we can't. Christ died for us. He did it for us. Nothing we did, not with gold or silver, but with His holy precious blood and His innocent suffering and death, that we can be His own and live with Him in everlasting righteousness, blessedness, and I missed a word. I missed it up somehow or another. But I think you're right, Marcia, because it pretty much has to be. Because we have to be, we can only reject the message. That we can do. He's certainly given us the free will to do that. Adam and Eve rejected the free salvation that they had, and they chose not to do it. They thought the tree of knowledge of good and evil was something worth looking into. They rejected it. They didn't have to. God didn't make them do it. So you can be cast out of the book of life, as David is telling us. And Paul writes in Philippians, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. So that is a good place to be. They helped Paul. They did things. That is not what got them in the book of life. They were already there. But their names were there. And they did nothing to sully their reputations. They did nothing to cheapen themselves. Their names are still there. I'm going to talk about the book of life at extreme length in a couple of weeks, because it seems kind of important to us to know, well, I mean, what do we got to do to be in the book of life? And I'll deal with that then. We go back to Revelation. This calls for a mind with wisdom. And that's something, when I pray, more often than not, I very rarely pray for things. Sometimes I do, not very often. What I pray an awful lot for is this. I pray for wisdom, and even more importantly, I pray for discernment. I pray that I can understand what God has put in front of me so I can figure out what He wants me to do. Because that, to me, is the most important thing. I don't care what God wants me to do. It's easier for me to say. He hasn't really, in my mind, thrown a whole lot of roadblocks in my way in my 50-plus years of life so far. Ask me when things get a little more difficult. I hope I'm still the same way. But that's why I always pray for that. Always. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 hills on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other is not. One heartening thing I found in a couple of the commentaries that I've been following on Revelation, they talk about these 5 kings that were. They suggest the first one was Egypt. Then the next one is, depending on how you define Assyria and Babylon, because they're basically the same. They're the same area. Whether they're the same kingdom or not is really up to define. Then you've got Persia. Then you've got Greece. They say those are the 5 kings. The one that is Rome. And you know what? And then at that point, almost every commentator says, but you know what? It beats me, and who cares? And so I very much like that too. You know, they don't know, and they really don't care. And so that pretty much leaves me free to not care myself. But when he does come, he only remains for a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. This is where I just kind of get lost, and I just kind of say whatever. David told you about the 7 hills a couple weeks ago. They are, of course, a reference to Rome. These are the 7 hills. And so I've never been to Rome. I don't really know. I know the Tiber flows through Rome. I don't know if this is considered Rome proper itself or not. I saw a picture last night that I knew was put up by a complete crank, because it showed a picture of, it had the Vatican, and then it had like a little beast there, and it had it connected to these 7 things. And I'm going to actually return to that in a little bit. But so when you say 7 hills, when you reference the 7 hills, this is not a mystery to these people. The 7 hills, at that time, was Rome. And I cannot emphasize enough just how big of a deal this is. So I'm going to put up yet another map of the Roman Empire. The other map, let's start here. The primary center of the world prior to the Roman Empire, well, let's go back to the time of Assyria and Babylon. That's right around here. Well, as time keeps moving, the modern world kind of starts creeping westward. So now you've got Greece was in charge of the modern world. Their empire extended to about here. And then that shifted westward more to Italy. Rome's right there. And you can see their boundaries are pretty much right about at the Holy Land. You got the better part of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. You've got the Holy Land, most of the northern coast of Africa. But the center of power in the modern world, the known world, I'll use it for lack of a better term, has been gradually shifting westward. There were still things going on over here. There were dynasties in China going back to thousands of years prior to this, and there's writings to that. But in the Western world, this is what we have a tendency to look at. You'll see that everything gradually was shifting to the west. What I don't know, and the thing I keep on trying to emphasize more than anything else, is the distance from here, Israel, to here. First, is not a crow's flight. You can't get there directly. You got to go around Sicily. So you got to go this way. That's about 1,200 miles. That is about the distance from here to the Atlantic Ocean. Actually, it's a little bit further than that. So you're not waking up one day saying, I'm going to go to Rome today and do a little bit of shopping. I don't know how fast a boat went. I was thinking about it in church today. I'm going to be generous, and I'm going to call it 10 miles an hour. And I'm going to be kind enough to say that they can maintain that for 24 hours a day by shifting their galley crews and that. So you can go about 240, 250 miles a day. That's assuming you've got the wind in your direction, which if you're going this way, it's probably not going to be the case. The chances are you're going against the wind this way. So I'm thinking you're looking, in the best of times, I'm thinking a 2-week trip. I'm thinking it's more accurate, a 1-month trip. 1 month. 1 month. And yet they are able to keep this people subjugated. They are able to keep these people, which is a little bit closer, but still, they are able to keep these people under their thumb. They are able to rule them almost tyrannically for the better part of the next 500 years. So when you talk about a kingdom, an all-oppressive kingdom, they didn't have to scratch their heads too hard to figure out what John was talking about, because they were living it at that day. The 10 horns you saw are the 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but for whom for 1 hour will receive authority. So these 10 kings, they see what time it is. Meet the new boss. He is not the same as the old boss. I'm going to go ahead and get in with that new boss. I'm going to grab onto that coattail and I'm going to go along for a ride. Yes, they will. For not very long. 1 hour. Not literal. What I clearly mean is for not very long. They'll have power, but it's not going to be for very long. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. Prostitution. They will take what they have, their power, their authority, their wealth, their riches, and they will give it to the beast for protection, probably. A little bit of wealth, why not? They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and with them will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. The angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and language. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. Why wouldn't they? The prostitute is a false church. The beast is the secular kingdom. They both want the same thing. Well, they're not going to win. They both can't win. And so they're going to try to kill her. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh or burn her with fire. For God has put into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's word is fulfilled. So at some point, that false church will be overturned by the false government. Now we jump into 18. And this is pretty much the beginning of the end. After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen! Fallen is Babylon the Great! She has become a dwelling for demons, and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal, for all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." Prostitute, prostitute. They sold themselves for money. Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. "How long, O Lord, how long?" said the saints underneath the altar. "I will tell you, not much longer. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she is given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup." Yeah, times were pretty good there for a while. You're riding right along. You're in with the in crowd. No one's hassling you. You're living large, eating well. You get to bully people in that. Hey, the time's going to come when there's going to be a price to be paid for that. You don't want to be on that side of the ledger. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. She will go from the heights of the heights to the depths of the depths. In her heart she boasts, "I sit enthroned as a queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn." Therefore, in one day, her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. You don't want to be this person. You don't want to be in this person's retinue. And it's going to be difficult, because things will be difficult for the Christian. The Christian in this time is going to be tormented. The Christian in this time is going to suffer persecution. The Christian in this time is going to need to be strong, and it's not going to be easy. That's the scariest part. That's the part where I hope I have the constitution, if I'm in those times, to be courageous enough to stand firm in Christ's word. Because if we don't stand firm, it's not going to end well. When the kings of the earth have committed adultery with her and shared her luxury, see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her, terrified at her torment, parentheses, and at their upcoming torment as well. They will stand far off. Who's that? I didn't know her. They will cry, woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come. The merchants will weep because nobody buys from them anymore. The sea captains will weep because they've got nothing to transverse anymore. They've got no more cargo. And a little bit here with some, I'm going to try to clarify a little bit of some of what I said, because a lot of this is quite confusing. And in many ways, that's kind of why every commentator seems to skip over it. But like I said, I wasn't smart enough to slough this off on David. So I ended up getting stuck talking about it. You've got Mystery Babylon. You've got, which was the prostitute. That's the worldwide religion. Babylon the Great, the city, the metaphorical city, is the politics. So as I said in the beginning, the whore of Babylon is the religion. She's prostituted herself. She's given up the true belief. The city of Babylon represents the true politics of that day. Who's in charge here? The false prophet, who is in charge of this false worldwide religion. And the leader of the secular world is the Antichrist. This person, we've seen the imagery, is like an adulterous woman. I should say adulterous person, quite frankly. Babylon the Great is like a great city, a wealthy city, a corrupt city more than anything else. When we think of corruption, do we think of a small town in Iowa of 500 people or anything like that? Or do we think of New York City, that den of iniquity, where there's, every bad thing on every corner or something like that? We tend to think of bad things with the big city. Don't go out to the big city, you're going to lose your way. The mission of the Mystery Babylon is false worship. And truly false worship in that they're actually supposed to worship not only a false religion, but a false religion that's based on secularism, the worship of the Antichrist, worshiping a government. And the job in Babylon is they will command all of Earth's resources. So instead of freedom, what they'll be doing is they'll be the one parceling out the resources, giving good stuff to people that follow them, not giving stuff out to people that don't follow them, and in many ways making people's lives miserable. That's the job. 7 hills, this is so that they can understand that this is, at least when John was writing the allegory, they could understand he's referring to Roman. And the Romans at that time were still worshiping false gods. They were worshiping Zeus. They were worshiping, their whole panoply of gods and that. Babylon the Great is visible from the sea. This is going to be destroyed by the kings of the earth. And like I said earlier, when you've got 2 false teachings, at some point somebody wants to be the one in charge. And so these people are eventually going to destroy them, but they are going to enjoy their victory for not very long, because God will eventually destroy them. We've seen that before. God uses many people to do His work. God used the Pharaoh to subjugate Israel, and He took care of Pharaoh when his time was up. God used kings all through the book of Judges in order to get Israel to think right, and as soon as they came around, God pretty much paved the way so that those people could go back into freedom. God used Sennacherib in the first Babylonian exile, and he used Nebuchadnezzar in the second Babylonian exile. He used them. Once they served their purpose, they were erased from the face of the earth. And all that is he's going to do that one final time. He will, again, use people, and when he's done with that use, he's going to pretty much take care of them also. And how are these people going to react? Nobody knows. The city, they're going to mourn. They've lost their livelihood. They've lost everything. They lost their leader. They lost everything they tied themselves to. And so when you believe in something and all of a sudden what you believe is proven wrong, well, that's a problem. And that's a problem that's going to have eternal consequences for these people. And that will lead to the day of the Lord. I'm reading a book right now about a group that none of you have ever heard of that have a song. And the name of that song is called The Day of the Lord. And it is one of the most depressing songs I've heard in my life. I love that song. It is an outstanding song. And if you knew anything about this group, you would understand it. Even the guy who wrote the book, he is a member of this group. The leader of that group committed suicide. He's like going, I don't really believe that we didn't listen to the lyrics in our songs prior to him doing that. Although we had to have been completely stupid. And he's pretty much blaming himself and his fellow bandmates. But you see the day of the Lord. You're going to see it referred to in Isaiah 2:2. You're going to see it in Amos 5. And most famously, you'll see it in Joel's second book. And that is the final judgment, where God is finally going to say, I have truly and certainly seen enough. Sin has piled up this high. We saw the reference earlier, the sin piled up to heaven. And at that point, there will be total and complete judgment. For those of us in this room, and as many as we can touch, and fellows like us that we can touch, we're going to bring as many along with us that are not going to feel the negative aspects of the day of this Lord. For us, it's going to be salvation. We long for this day. We yearn for this day. We pray for this day so that we no longer need to be on this mortal coil, but we can actually be in heaven with God. We don't fear this day. We can't wait for it. We're probably not too thrilled about the intervening events that get to that day. But when this day comes, it's over. And we can spend time with Christ forever. Well, for the people on the wrong side of this, not necessarily that good. And David's going to discuss that in a little bit more detail next week. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the bad things of the book of Revelation. We are done with the dire warnings, with the bad imagery, with the lurid things in that. We still have one bad thing left, and that is going to be the judgment of those that don't believe. And that's sad. That is truly sad. But we're done. David gets to tell you about how the Lord is finally going to be victorious. David.
Homework next week, read Revelation 19. And as I have heard Scott talk today, I've reflected on a history course I took which talked about universal values. And for whatever reason that came to my mind during this class, wisdom, justice, moderation, and courage. So reflect on those this week. I'm going to try to tie those in with Revelation 19 and kind of where we've been in Revelation.
I'll give you a little homework assignment then. If you say that, look up the 7 cardinal virtues. I think that'll also tie in very nicely with what you just said right there. Because they go along with the 7 deadly sins. There are 7 virtues as well. And I think you just named 4 of them off the top of my head. So you might as well do the other 3 and do a complete list. Because it is 7, so we might as well do that also. But, and those are things...
mentioned in the courts.
But, that, of course, is the unfortunate thing, is those are things that are supposed to be universal. And yet, in today's world, now we're being told that those things aren't true, or that we can define them as we wish, and that they don't mean what they used to mean. And it's really sad. Who would like to open us in prayer next week? Come on. Why is it that hard? I'm not pulling fingernails here or anything. Thank you, Paula. I was going to ask you anyway, so I appreciate that anyway. So let's go ahead and close in prayer. Dear Lord, on this day after Easter, as always, we give thanks that you sent your Son for our salvation. We understand that we did absolutely nothing to earn that salvation. There's nothing we ever could do, and that all you've ever done is your gift to us that is completely undeserved on our part. But that comes with an expectation. That is the expectation that we're not going to keep that gift to ourselves. You gave it to us with every expectation that we would fulfill it and spread it out. It was so important. It was the very last thing you said to your followers prior to your ascension. So be with us as we go through this week. Because whether we're not in the end times, I don't know. But I certainly don't rule out that fact. And it doesn't really matter anyway. Because for all of us, at some point or another, our end is going to come. And we need to make sure that we bring as many people with us into your kingdom. It's a big heaven. I think we can fit as many people up there as we can get. So continue to send your Holy Spirit to us, to embolden us, to open our minds, open our hearts. Grant us the wisdom to know what it is you would have us to do, and most importantly, the courage to actually follow through and do it. Be with us as we go through this week, and all this we ask in Jesus' name.